Thomas. I am the Dean of the School of Educational Studies and would like to welcome you to, I've lost count of what number this is in our speaker series, but it's yet another evening with yet another distinguished and special guest of ours, a close friend and dear colleague and a real role model for many of us in the room tonight. And I'm happy to be able to be a part of Gary's talk, and Cecilia will introduce him properly. But let me say thank you, and let me say thank you to all of you for continuing to turn out for the wonderful events that we've been so fortunate to have put together, and thank Cecilia Rios Aguilar for her diligent oversight and generative energies around the speakers list that we put together this year. The people that we've been fortunate enough to have visit with us have come largely as a result of Cecilia's careful thought, vetting, and coercion in some instances, Gary. And so we'd like to thank Cecilia. And just a couple of reminders. Next week we have the Sally Lloyd Casanova Distinguished Alumna Lecture, and we'll have Christine Dillon coming to us from the Consortium on Higher Education Finance. And she'll be delivering next week's lecture, and I think it's entitled College, Do We Really Want to Make It Cost Less? Or I'm probably paraphrasing the title, but it's something like that. And this is one of our keynote lectures of the year, and we bring an alumnus back each year to deliver this lecture. And it will be Tuesday night in Albrecht Auditorium at 7:30, and I hope that you'll be able to join us. After that, we have Jack Scott giving another talk on the 16th of April, and he will talk on the history and future of the community college. And then we will have Alfredo Ortiz on what date do we know? May 9th, the last speaker in the series for this year. Tonight, also from Arizona. Yeah, I know. You'll notice the other common theme is that we have a lot. It's the hit parade. I had someone tonight that I was walking to dinner with. Actually, it was my son. Said, "Gee, Dad, you have a lot of people from Arizona coming in to do these talks and like working with you." And I said to them, I said, well, earlier in my career, I went to Arizona, and I discovered that some of my favorite people are there, and some of the best people I've ever worked with are in Arizona. And since I couldn't stay in Arizona, and my wife's in the back of the room, and Arizona didn't quite work out for us, for reasons unrelated to our occupation.
There's no beach.
Okay. No secrets here in this room. But I said I just tried to make it a point to hire the best people that I've encountered in my career there. And we didn't get Gary to other places that I've worked, but we did get a lot of your colleagues, and I'm very fortunate. We're all very fortunate to have Cecilia working with us now from Arizona. So the Arizona connection is one that runs deep and dear to me. Tonight, the ground rules are Cecilia will introduce Gary. Gary will give us a riveting and concise yet cutting talk. And then we'll open it up for questions and conversation. And Gary, I think you'll find that as we've had in past evenings, that we'll have an energetic discussion after your talk. And with that, I'd like to invite my dear colleague and friend Cecilia up to do the honors. Thank you.
I'm going to use this one. He instructed me this is on.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to do a formal introduction, a little bit, and then some informal comments I'm going to make about my colleague here. But Professor Gary Rhoades is head of the Department of Educational Policy Studies and Practice, and he's a professor and director of the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona. He got his PhD in sociology from UCLA, and he's been a professor in Arizona since 1986, the year the World Cup was played in Mexico. So a very good moment for Gary to move to Arizona. He served as a general secretary of the American Association of University Professors in DC. He left us. We were heartbroken. But we have forgiven him for that absence because he came back to Arizona full force and ready to continue the important fights. His scholarship focuses on restructuring of academic institutions and of professions in the academy, as well as on science and technology policy and comparative higher education. He has written many books Two of my favorite are Managed Professionals and Academic Capitalism and the New Economy. He has written, I don't know how many articles, too many, never too many. And he has received many awards. His most recent award was this past ASH. He won the Leadership Award, his favorite award. But this is, of course, a formal CV, but I have to personally say that he is the person who gave me my first opportunity in academia. So I will be always eternally grateful for someone who believed in me, not only in paper, but as in person. And he gave me my first shot, and I would not be here if it wasn't for him. I profoundly admire him, not only because he's a great thinker and an inspiring scholar, but because he's a fighter. And he's, as Daryl Smith told me yesterday, the troublemaker is here. He has taught me that it's important to speak up, to speak out, and to really fight for social justice and for change. So I'm profoundly grateful that he decided to come here to join us. And I really admire him, not only, like I said, because he's a fabulous scholar, but because he's also an excellent human being. And rarely in academia, you find a person like Gary who has inspired and changed many, many lives, including myself. So thank you very much. I'll introduce my friend.
Well, it's all downhill from here. Well, thank you for that, both the introductions, but that was really marvelous. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Thanks to Scott, too, and to all of you for the opportunity to come back to Claremont. I went to high school here, so I kind of, back in the day, back in the late 60s and early 70s, my parents still live here. So I know this place a little bit, and I know this university a little bit, and the surrounding colleges, the seminary. My dad actually taught at the seminary for over 3 decades, taught some classes here. And I know the place a little bit through the superb scholars who are here, like Daryl and Jack. And it was kind of fun receiving that award. It was even more fun because Daryl was receiving the service award. It was the Howard Bowen Award, which is, I know, for her particularly special and richly deserved. And some colleagues who I've known a little bit shorter amount of time, but I also have a lot of affection for, Scott and Cecilia, and it's great to see Debbie here as well. So again, I sort of know this place, and you got a special place as a graduate university, primarily applied social sciences. You have a collegial, creative, cross-disciplinary set of traditions, and particularly in education, a commitment to social justice, really interesting technology work, which I'm going to try and tap into. Juana was asking me earlier if I was going to try and disrupt something, because she's heard that word a couple times and out of my mouth as well. What would I disrupt? And I immediately said technology, which you'll hear more about tonight. And Cecilia's Gates grant with another great colleague of mine, Regina Dialamen, I think is sort of yet the latest example of the good work that's going on here in technology. So I'm going to try and situate my remarks accordingly, and hopefully there'll be a conversation that comes out of this that informs what I try to continue to do in the field. Part of that situating also, in this case, is not just the university and the good work that you're doing, but the context of this very cool speaker series. And the remarks last month of a dear friend of mine, Luis Moll, who I was telling Cecilia, I don't actually think I've heard him give a presentation before, so it was kind of fun. I got on the internet, I kind of wanted to see what the venue was like. I guess it was another room, there were leaves in the background or something. And I really enjoyed his lecture. Luis and I guess we didn't realize, Luis probably knew the World Cup was in Mexico that year, but I didn't. Came to the University of Arizona the same year in 1986. That was a very good year. We also came from the same university, UCLA. I came out of sociology. And on a few occasions over the years, and I'm mentioning this for an explicit reason, it has to do with the theme of his talk, which I'm going to come to in the end. Over the years, we've done some things together more through our students than directly, including work with a parent college academy that was set up about 10 years ago by some of our students. And I've always been interested in and compelled by his understanding of the importance of the local and of the community and of the resources and the assets of local communities. And that is going to be something that I come back to at the end of my remarks today, and thinking about a disruptive technology that I hope we can introduce amidst MOOC mania, and instead deal with technologies that are more locally situated and relevant to people's lives. So with that, let me turn to sort of the title of the talk. And I'm talking out of a couple of areas of work today. One, a couple things that I've done, mainly what I'm in the midst of working on. And one of the things that came out recently was a piece in Liberal Education on the completion agenda. It's a whole issue of liberal education, which has been sort of the champion historically, the association that publishes that, the AAC&U, historically been the champion of liberal quality education. And that association, probably more than any other in Washington, D.C. right now, has expressed considerable concern about the path that we're on as colleges and universities and as higher education systems in the United States, in terms of not living up to and not pursuing directions that necessarily are going to be enhancing quality in higher education. And so that is really, that article that I wrote as part of that special issue was entitled The Incomplete Completion Agenda. And so what I want to just briefly walk through is the ideas in that article as one set of framing remarks. And then there's two other sets of framing remarks. I deal in lots of threes because I am the son of a Christian theologian, so trinities come pretty naturally to me. So that first set comes out of that article, dealing with what are the sorts of patterns in our focus increasingly on completion, not only at the national level, but particularly at the state level. And how does that play out in terms of addressing the fundamental challenges that we face, educational challenges, social challenges, and the challenge of the new so-called new economy and laying the foundation for that new economy. The second set of remarks, or second framing of what I'm talking about, comes out of a book I published over a decade ago focused on the restructuring of academic labor and work. And I'm in the process of updating that with a much larger database of bargaining agreements, but more importantly with an expanded experience of and sense of what's happening in the field, having visited so many places during the 2.5 years that I was General Secretary for the AUP, and then the continued contacts that I've had with labor leaders in the field in subsequent years. So sort of infusing more of the process and the energy and the dynamism of what's happening on the ground in this negotiation of a new academy. And I want to emphasize that a lot because we hear so much about systems and the power of systems. And what I want to emphasize we're in a moment of contest and potential for negotiation. I'm personally one who thinks you can negotiate just about everything. And there's a lot of evidence in our country today of policies being renegotiated, sometimes by groups that on the outside of it don't seem to have a tremendous amount of formal power. So that second framing is a political sociologist framing of the ability and the contest over shaping where the academy's headed. Third set builds on and extends the work that Sheila Slaughter and I have done in academic capitalism and the new economy. And also comes out of my engagement with a grassroots group of academic labor leaders in an effort to negotiate a new academy, to change the terms of the conversation nationally, to change the local negotiations over terms and conditions, not just of employment, but over the direction of institutions, and to change the nature of higher education policy and practice accordingly. So there's an intersection here that I want to emphasize that really runs throughout most of my work, and Cecilia nicely spoke to it in introducing me. At some point in my career, pretty early on, the scholarship wasn't enough for me. I wanted to have a sense that I was engaged in these negotiations over where our academy is headed and where our country is headed in a more direct way. And so the sort of moving back and forth between activism and academic scholarship is something that will become clear in my remarks later on. And again, I want to emphasize we are at a particularly critical juncture as a country. You are clearly at a particularly critical juncture as a state. This is a state where I got all my degrees. The state is moving in entirely the wrong direction, in my view, in terms of meeting the needs of the growth demographics in American society, whether of traditional and non-traditional students. And we, obviously, in Arizona, I hail from the desert now, no water, Scott, is also in the midst of great contest at the schools level, and most recently in a case I'll talk about a little bit at the community college level. So what I want to try and do with these framing ideas is something I talked about with the students, a number of students before doing this talk, is to try and connect these grand sort of policy developments, national developments, international developments in the direction of higher education policy, the things that we're experiencing, Mexico's experiencing, Europe's experiencing, Japan's experiencing, to connect those to local lived daily experiences of staff and faculty and students and communities with regard to higher education. I think too often we see these as separate domains. And I want to concentrate on the power of the local, of the grassroots groups that can, in my view, actually leverage significant, even systemic change. So let me just briefly start with the liberal education piece and the basic themes. First, so what is this completion agenda? And part of my theme is the completion agenda is counterproductive in terms of each of the challenges that we face as a nation. There's educational challenges. We have a challenge to enhance, just generally, to enhance educational quality, and more specifically, to enhance and more successfully engage underserved populations that are the growth demographics of our prospective student bodies. There's also a social challenge that I'll map out a little bit later in terms of increased inequity, what I would call non-meritocratic social stratification. You can say there's social stratification, and that's problematic enough. It becomes even yet more problematic when it's social stratification that violates any conception of merit, even the dominant ones, which obviously I'm not too enamored of myself. And then third, the sort of challenge of building what is the structure for a sustainable, viable quality of life in a so-called new society with a knowledge-based society and a new economy. So we have this completion agenda that really focuses on increased productivity. Too often it gets into a reductionist agenda promoted by organizations like the National Governors Association, a focus on graduation rates that sets up a whole set of problematic incentives for all kinds of colleges and universities, particularly for community colleges and particularly for access-oriented institutions. There's an increased emphasis on completion of any kind, even and maybe even particularly at the national level, having set a great goal of dramatically expanding the proportion of our population that receives a post-secondary education. The Obama administration pretty quickly shifted completion to include and count credentials and short cycle certificates. And so what we mean by completion and what we mean by a college education is changing, particularly in community colleges, sort of before our very eyes. Limited resources, so we need to do more with less, and a whole set of performance-based accountability measures, including graduation, but also other sorts of measures, that in a variety of ways, I think, foreground the wrong finish lines. They stop too short. They don't follow students into the next phase of their lives, whether it's graduate and professional education or into the workplace or into citizenship or into a whole variety of life realms. And they miss the right foundation of what's fundamental to students succeeding at any level of education. And then, as I said, there's a tremendous increase in non-meritocratic social stratification that we see in society generally. Essentially, and I'm going to speak to this in community colleges in particular, just as we've been building a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border to keep out the influx of populations and people seeking opportunity, so we are building retaining walls in our academy, and particularly in the open access points of entry that will keep out the growth demographics of our population. The incentive structures that we've set up statewide, which is part of my basic argument here, what is disincentivized, is there's an emphasis. I was sitting on a national panel when I was in DC, and these are people whose whole lives have been devoted to trying to promote some sort of access in American higher education. So a lot of community college presidents and leaders on this group dealing with issues like performance-based budgeting. And as one of them said to me, what we're essentially doing is refocusing on those students who are most likely to succeed. Because as we're getting hammered and pushed to dramatically increase in the short term our success rate and our completion rate, the easiest way to do that is to change our student population. And you can see that in a variety of settings in American higher education, but perhaps the most heartbreaking is in community colleges. In that context, we see a variety of students, again, the growth demographic, first generation, lower income, students of color, immigrants, both documented and undocumented, non-traditional students like returning vets, displaced workers, people who never got the GED, women who are cycling back into the educational system. All of these are seen as at risk, less likely to succeed, more expensive. They require special services. Maybe they even require financial aid. They're expensive. They're not ready. They're not college ready. So this new term that sort of depersonalizes that we're not willing to engage the great unwashed who are not college ready apparently now. And if they are college ready, what they're really ready for is a short cycle certificate, not, or a virtual education. We'll talk a little bit about that, not a real bricks and mortar education. None of these issues, none of these strategies, the performance-based budgeting, the graduation rate, short cycle certificates, none of these completion agenda strategies speaks to either quality or inequality or to what we're going to look like as a society in 15 or 20 years and how we're going to thrive in a very different world. Okay, so now the second framing. And here I'm obviously centering what for me, not just my book, but sort of the whole analytical fulcrum of my work over the course of my career, which is coming out of the sociology of higher education, understanding the conditions of work, of our labor as faculty, and the very structure of the academic workforce, and indeed of the professional workforce generally in higher education, collectively as a workforce, as a negotiation. And in this book, the negotiation is primarily between management and labor, which many faculty are uncomfortable calling themselves, but that's what the vast majority of us are being, in some sense, reduced to. And I see that negotiation encapsulated sort of most clearly in collective bargaining agreements. And I started studying unionized institutions because I really, at some level, wanted to begin to spend more time focusing on the access institutions, which in my view had been understudied in research in higher education. So the community colleges, but also the four-year institutions like your Cal States, but a lot of the geographically modified names of systems throughout the country, which are open access institutions. Most of those public institutions are unionized. So this was a vehicle for understanding how's this negotiation taking place in these key institutions, which I would argue, but it's not just me. I heard Pat Callan at a recent conference, he's a name that you should be familiar with in California, say the future of this country is contingent not upon what Stanford or Harvard does, but upon what the access colleges and universities do. That's where our future as a country lies. To what extent are those institutions more successful than they have been in the past? To what extent do we invest in those institutions to be more successful? That's where our future lies. So I see that negotiation then as fundamental. And I've sort of changed the title a little bit. I'm playing tentatively with the title. But there's another dimension that I want to focus on with regard to that negotiation. We have this sort of privatized rhetoric now, and we have professionally, we sort of construct ourselves in this way, as individuals who are delivering education, or in an even more privatized sense, delivering information, not just education. I actually see us as engaged in a negotiated reality, that this is a collective process. It's a social process, and it's a matter of contesting and trying to define and redefine what is a professional domain about and who has authority within and over that professional domain. And so for me, these agreements, and in this book it was 211 agreements, in the expanded database I'm using it's over 600. They're just a vehicle for understanding what's happening more broadly to the academic labor force. And so the title in 98 was Managed Professionals. But when I thought about, well, should I say more or less managed professionals? I decided, no, we're in this moment of tremendous energy and contest over what the academy is going to look like from a variety of sectors of the academic workforce. And so I decided I really wanted to feature that and think not about a fixed term like managed, but an active or a passive term, but an active term of organizing. And organizing in a whole variety of ways, not just in unions, but in advocacy groups, in spontaneous combustion groups about saving our university. And you see this throughout American higher education in a variety of sectors of the academic workforce. Some of the most dramatic and most recent are among postdocs in the highly valued field of STEM fields. Great resources invested in these fields, but not great resources actually invested in the academics who work in these fields, a large proportion of whom, the majority of whom, are international. And so about 6 years ago, the UAW of all organizations organized the entire postdoc workforce of the University of California. That's 10% of the postdoc workforce nationally. And then more recently last year, also organized and negotiated a first contract at UMass Amherst and then subsequently at Rutgers, both the latter I helped with. And it's interesting if you begin to think about what our pitch is as a higher ed system to students. Study hard, do well, get an advanced degree, and boy, really get an advanced degree in STEM, and the world is your oyster. The average pay for postdocs at UMass Amherst, and I don't know how many of you know anything about Amherst, but it's not a cheap place to live, to put it mildly. These are STEM PhDs. It was $35,000. About half of them had any health care. And the term now for postdocs, by the way, for people in addition to myself who study this, Paula Stefan and a variety of others, is perm docs. Because you get the first postdoc, then you get a second, then you get a third, you're 42 years old, you got a couple kids, you have no health care, and you're making $37,000 a year. You see the same kind of phenomenon taking place among graduate employees who at one time could have been said to be apprentices getting ready for that nice tenure track job, and it is a great job, I love what I do, but increasingly those jobs aren't available. And so the grad employees are getting active and organizing. And then there's a variety of other student groups at the undergraduate level that I'll talk about in a little bit that are also challenging the structure of the system. There's a lot of organizing among contingent faculty, part-time faculty, in some really interesting and creative ways that I'll also be talking about. So a lot of energy. In fact, when I started at the AUP, I suggested to the folks there, this is the most active time of organizing in 30 years in American higher education. And organizing not just over wage and health care and protecting, organizing around where is our academy headed. The most common complaint that I heard as I went around the country, and I went to an awful lot of places in those 2.5 years, was a sense of having no voice in shaping an academy that still had a public good role, a public good function, a commitment to something other than its short-term immediate prestige and bottom line. So that's sort of the second framing. Then I just want to jump to technology, since I featured that earlier. And I want to feature just a couple of ideas here very briefly. One is the overall slide is entitled The Social Embeddedness of Technology. And so Cecilia has a great Gates project on getting connected. What's fascinating about that, and I think she and Regina and some of their students have a good deal to write about this, but I'm going to try and get them to write about this particular issue as well, is the creators of this schools app that they're studying that is aimed at creating community and is being applied to community colleges because it's a Gates grant, and Gates cares about community colleges, not four-year places. They have in their mind a concept of what a college is. And that concept is driven by their experience of college at Stanford and other elites. It's a four-year concept. It's a residential concept. It's a concept of going to college and living at college that doesn't describe reality for 85% even of traditional age students. And yet that technology has embedded within it, it's sort of going to be the solution to creating community in disparate community college settings, rural and urban. But the whole concept of it is framed by a very traditional conception of what students are, what college is, and what going to college means. So the social embeddedness. Similarly, you can think about what's embedded in us running a MOOC, as one of my colleagues said recently. We're running a MOOC, these massive open online courses. The term in the media now is basically MOOC mania. This is an efficiency, a Tayloristic efficiency sort of dream. One professor, 150,000 students, maybe peer-generated discussions, a few people facilitating, and that's a really efficient system. Embedded in that is a sense of what education is. And it's remarkable because we've spent 15 or 20 years trashing lectures and not being engaged and having discussions, and now there's this fascination with a model that is entirely a talking head. And then, the peons out there can discuss things, but the real expert is simply lecturing. So in a whole variety of ways, the technologies, and I could go on, but I won't because otherwise we'll be here all night, have embedded understanding, structures, hierarchies, and interests. And within each of the suggested paths I'm going to offer a disruptive technology. But I'm going to connect that technology, I'm going to couple it to collective action. Because I think too rarely in higher education do we think about the collective action and the political force that creates stuff in our system. And I want to use that to complete the completion agenda. So that's what I'm up to. Where have we been headed? For decades, this idea that Sheila Slaughter and Larry Leslie first coined in the mid-90s in their book on economic capitalism, then Sheila and I revisited in Academic Capitalism and the New Economy. Just a total sort of privatization of higher ed's purposes and a new circuitry, the conscious choice of the term circuitry, of how you produce and disseminate research and teaching and service. So privatization of purpose. And I picked a couple quotes here. I don't know how well you can read the one on the left. It's from the Truman Commission in 1947. Sort of a classic statement of what the purposes of higher education are and what the purposes of community colleges are as well. Equal opportunity for all persons to the maximum of their individual abilities without regard to economic status, race, creed, color, sex, national origin, or ancestry is a major goal of American democracy. Democracy. There's nothing in there about competitiveness. It's about democracy. It's post-World War II, post having just fought fascism. Only an informed, thoughtful, tolerant people can develop and maintain a free society. Not an energetic, vital economy, but a free society. So a foregrounding of our democratic purposes as a higher education system. Then down here in the lower section, we have a couple of things about the Obama administration. I'm not trashing the administration entirely, but this speaks to a sort of narrowing of the conception of what higher education is about. It's not personalized to them, but it's to the times that we're in. So in 2012, the Obama administration announces $500 million in community college grants to expand job training through local employer partnerships. So you're seeing a conception of community colleges not as a route to four-year institutions and broadening of horizons, but as a short cycle path into the workforce. And probably the most vivid representation of that was in 2009 with the stimulus package, when on the one hand, the administration is really to be commended for focusing on community colleges. And I wish you could have all been in the rooms that I was in and listened to the representatives of four-year places, research universities, liberal arts colleges, land-grant universities. What is all this focus on community colleges? What about us? What happened to us? So really, for the first time in some years, a major focus on these institutions. There was a whittling down of the amount of money that eventually went to community colleges, but what's even more striking is that money was shifted from the Department of Education to the Department of Labor, and it was exclusively for workforce development programs. So that juxtaposition sort of captures a reframing of what the purposes of education are for at the national level. And then I've got sort of these little, so Coursera, I'm sure most of you have some sense of what that's about. Pearson, which is coming up with a range of goods and services and curricula, particularly focusing on general education, that they can provide either wholesale to institutions, that they can provide online, and also some that can be adapted by individual faculty. Competency-based learning, and then this massive open online curriculum courses. And the emphasis on short cycle certificates that, as I sort of euphemistically say, I wonder what they're a path to, actually. Then at the same time, we have this heightened stratification. I've just picked one slide here. This is income. It's not wealth, it's income. If it was wealth, it would be even worse. And you've probably all seen the graphs about the increased separation between the haves and the have-nots, greater at this point than at any time in 100 years. What I don't have up there, because there's not room on one slide, is the fabulous and horrific slide of the Delta Project that shows spending per student and number of students. So just visualize. You got a bar graph, and on one end are community colleges, and on the other end are private research universities. One of the bars is number of students. Community colleges are way up here. Private universities are way down here. The other bar, right next to it, is what is the spending per student? And an order of magnitude of 2 or 3. So tremendous inequality in spending per student in the different sectors. And the Delta Project and a variety of other national reports have really raised the issue in public policy that community colleges continue to take the biggest hits in a variety of ways to get the least amount of resources, and yet they're the ones at the point of access for half the undergraduates. They educate half the undergraduates in their point of access for working class students and students of color. 43% of African Americans, 60% of Latinos start at community colleges. And there's also this other thing that's happening with stratification, and that is this incredible student debt. Over $1 trillion, it's now higher than credit card debt. And if you think about that classic paper by Burton Clark on the cooling out function, and I have a student right now doing a dissertation on student debt, and I said, so how is cooling out different today than it was 60 years ago? So she kind of walked through it. So 60 years ago, cooling out is you start an academic track, you kind of get cooled out. Well, why don't you be realistic about your expectations? Why don't you get into this welding program or this auto mechanic program or some sort of blue-collar vocational program? You get cooled out. But maybe you still have a job. What cooling out now is, you apply to a community college in California and they say, sorry, the inn is closed, it's full. You decide then to go to a for-profit institution, which is pretty effective and efficient and strategic in targeting your neighborhood and your demographic. You end up with a disproportionate share of the student debt, which for-profits have, and a disproportionate share of student default on that debt. So now you're not just cooled out with a less highly positioned job in terms of wages than you originally aspired to. You've defaulted on your student loan and you're financially doomed. Your wages can be garnered, you can't work for the government, you're just basically screwed. The consequences of being cooled out in this context reflect a heightened and harsher stratification than 60 years ago. One of my colleagues, Ozan Jaquette, and his dissertation chair, Mike Bastido, did a nice piece 2 years ago entitled, well, the title pretty much tells it all. They're looking at, for 1976 or so to 2003, what is the relative position of low-income students to middle and upper middle income students in terms of their college attainment running in place. So there's increases, but the relative gap persists. In some ways you could argue, given our current policies, it's probably going to get worse. There's an even more recent paper out by Carolyn Hawksby of Stanford and Christopher Avery, an NBER paper in late 2012 on the hidden supply of high-achieving, low-income students who are not being recruited by elite institutions. Now, Ozan, and I kind of agree with him, says this fixation just on the talented few can be a little irritating. But the point is still really important. Even the most talented in traditional academic terms, students from low-income backgrounds don't have the same kind of access in any measure. And part of the Hawksby's and Avery's paper, which is really interesting, is what's the college choice process? How many schools do they apply to and the like? Fundamentally different. So we have this heightened social stratification, and what goes along with that is a tremendous change in the professional stratification of the academic workforce. So the numbers here are pretty self-explanatory, but they're really just dramatic. So I came into the profession in '86, 73, a decade before that, 22% part-time. It's now basically half. If you're in a community college, it's 70%. In my state, it's 75%. That's not people not on the tenure track. That's people working in part-time positions, sometimes cobbling together several of them. So they're not part-timers. They're in part-time positions. And oh, by the way, the Affordability Care Act is in the process, colleges and universities are responding to that by dropping, and so each of the major faculty unions is gathering data on this, dropping the teaching loads of part-time and contingent faculty in order to not have to pay health benefits. So you got a Health Care Act designed to expand health care provision. And you have higher education, which is supposed to lead the way in a good way, leading the way almost no differently than cynically some businesses are doing. Full-time non-tenure track faculty, and Jack's great work in this regard was one of the first to really highlight this non-tenure track full-time workforce and to recognize that in recent cohorts there's more employment or more initial hires out of that into those categories and into tenure track. So 19%. What you see in a lot of those positions is they're not just doing teaching, it's full-time researchers on soft money. Postdocs. I'm doing a paper right now with a former student at Michigan State, Brendan Cantwell, and some of the initial stuff we're doing. The biggest predictor of research monies now is number of postdocs. It's not number of grad students, it's number of postdocs. This is sort of the new production model for producing research. And Brenda did a fabulous, sad dissertation looking at US and UK universities, interviewing PI, principal investigators, and international postdocs, mostly from China and India, talking to the PIs about, so what do you think these people's chances are of becoming faculty? Hard workers, never complain, there all weekend. But, you know, conceptually, so the takeaway line from that article is basically first world science is being driven and conducted by third world labor. Just like on the teaching side, you see a total change in our production model from a full-time workforce to a part-time and contingent workforce. Anyone who says that higher education hasn't changed as an industry is ignoring this and also ignoring the same things happening with students. The pattern of attendance now is part-time, not full-time. And this is taking place, I wanted to emphasize below, not just in teaching, but also in research, not just in English and composition, but also in STEM fields. So I have a student right now doing an interesting dissertation on secondary STEM labor markets. And the trigger for that was an observation coming out of a grant she was working on of Cecilia and myself and Jenny Lee, in which we were interviewing people and sort of mapping their social networks. One person that was interviewed, the graduate student, Blanca Torres, said, well, there's this adjunct scientist at UCLA, and he's an adjunct scientist at USC as well. And he works for a nonprofit. And he and his partner have a small business. We're like, are all those active affiliations? And that's what was asked of the scientist. And he goes, I have student loans to pay off. And my partner and I have to try and support a family. He was 10 years out of a graduate degree, prestigious place, lots of publications, lots of grants. He is in a secondary labor market. He's doomed. He's there. He's going nowhere else. That's in a STEM field. Now, let's shift to negotiating a new academy with some disruptive technologies, and in parentheses, because technology is disembodied, with collective action. So I want to sort of show 3 examples, and I'm going to briefly go over the first one, talk a little more about the second, and especially the third one, which will bring us back to Luis, funds of knowledge, locally relevant communities, and curriculum that is linked to those. What I want to do here is simply emphasize the importance as I say up here, of a variety of student and community-based social movements and actions that are grounded in articulating and in a public pursuit of a dream. And as you'll see in the next slide, there are different kinds of dreams that we're talking about. The most obvious one to this audience will be the dreamers. But there's other types of dreams that are a little bit older and no less significant than the dreamer's dream. And then there are grassroots, locally based groups surfacing and trying to bring to the surface the idea of how much contingency there is in the faculty labor force and what that means for students and educational quality. As so many people working, so many contingent faculty and so many people working with contingent faculty want to emphasize, as rotten as the working conditions are, we really shouldn't expect people out in the real world to get the violins out for any faculty. The issue, and I'm going to come to that in a little bit, for us in trying to change the academy is to engage more successfully, and this is a good institution to talk about that because you engage your community pretty well. Engage more successfully the communities that we serve and in which we're situated, rather than to ask those communities, which are also going through all these kinds of trends, heightened social stratification, part-time employment, little health care, why should they feel sorry for us? We need to be in a common enterprise. And what these grassroots groups are doing, and I'm part of one of them called the Campaign for the Future of Higher Education, is trying to disrupt the pattern of employment, which is often just in time, people being hired at the last minute, just in the classroom, people being hired not to advise and do other things, but only to come in, teach, and leave, and people being hired just at will, which totally compromises any ability to maintain a sense or semblance of academic freedom or academic standards, and engage their students with controversial, meaningful, tough material. And then another way of thinking about a disruptive technology is organizationally through unions and advocacy groups working with community groups and reversing the circuitry, as I'm going to say, of academic capitalism in the new economy with MICs, not MOOCs. And I'll get to what I mean by that in a minute. MOOCs are these mass-produced, mass-marketed education of Pearson, which is owned by the Financial Times in the UK, and Coursera, with metro or rural-based participant action developed curricula that are owned by collectives of local communities. So let me move to that. Just very briefly on the student movements, just to give you, I know it can be so depressing to be in the midst of a time when everything seems to be terrible and policies that come down seem insane, and the cuts and the cuts and the cuts, and you hear about the need to realign. I gather you're realigning just like everyone else. Sometimes it's useful to take a pause and say, think about this for a moment. So I started with the Dreamers. Here's a group that is more disenfranchised than just about any group you could think of in American society. This group of formerly under-resourced prospective students who are, as their phrasing goes, United We Dream, undocumented and unafraid, are leveraging legislation. They're leveraging it at state levels. So Maryland this past election passed a DREAM Act. They're in the process of leveraging at least something, probably not what we would all want, probably not as much as is needed, but something. A totally under-resourced group is able to leverage and change a national agenda about immigration. And social media is not irrelevant to their ability to have done this, and the use of a variety of technologies in disruptive and collective organizing ways. Similarly, the U.S. Student Association, the oldest student association in the country, has been running successful campaigns putting on the agenda cost, or really tuition, because that's different than cost, saying education's a right and debt undermines that right. And now we have an administration and now we have a public discourse that recognizes the level of the debt. The solutions to that may not be ideal, but the conversation is changing. And again, this is not, the U.S. Student Association is not, the Koch brothers don't support them. They don't have mega bucks. It's a remarkably successful advocacy group. In my own community, the Unidos and the students in TUSD who took over the boardroom when the board was making a decision to disband Mexican-American studies, and who succeeded in garnering national and even international attention on this issue. And although most of you have read about it, they're winning. The curriculum's back. Huppenthal is still there. Horn is still there. The superintendent, Horn was the superintendent, now the attorney general. Huppenthal's now the superintendent. The curriculum is there again. It's a victory, even though the taking away of this curriculum was a remarkably disrespectful and aggressive and hostile act, not only towards the students and the communities, but towards the teachers who had developed this curriculum and were teaching it. We're in the midst, in my own community as well, in the higher education community, Pima Community College has just been put on probation by North Central Association. There are a range of charges, 9 charges. I've read the 30-page report from the Higher Learning Commission, and there are a variety of very serious charges. Arguably one of the most interesting ones is that Pima abandoned its open access mission. That it set up a test. If you didn't pass the test, you had to take a remedial course. You had to pay extra money for that course. Their enrollment dropped 11%. They were cutting developmental education. They were saying, we're not going to be doing this anymore. We're not doing developmental education. We're going to orient ourselves to the more likely to succeed students. The Higher Learning Commission comes in, investigates it, and says, you didn't consult with the community sufficiently. You didn't consult with the faculty. You didn't consult with the people within your institution, the staff and the students as well. Pima right now, the board is in the process of voting on whether to rescind that decision about abandoning open admissions. That is a huge victory. That's the same board, by the way, that just voted to have in-state tuition for for undocumented students who go through DACA. And then another conception of DREAM, a graduate student of mine who's been working with undergraduates at 5 universities in Florida who call themselves Dream Defenders. These African-American students. They were triggered by a range of events, but probably the most dramatic one was the killing of Trayvon Martin. And I talked to Charles Davis, who's doing this research and is one of the organizers of this group, and I said, so when you say dream, that's an interesting choice of term. For someone of my generation, it's an obvious choice. We're at the 50-year anniversary of I Have a Dream. But in this context, so I said, to what extent has your group, several hundred students, talked about dreamers in relation to the dream? He said, you know, we got a lot of work to do on LGBTQ, and we haven't done that. That's really interesting, isn't it? There's room for greater coalitions even among the student movements. Now, let me just jump, and I'm actually going to skip this one for reasons of time. I want to get to the MOOCs. I'm part of this group called the Campaign for the Future of Higher Ed. We partnered with a national advocacy group for contingent faculty called the New Faculty Majority, and I'm on the foundation of that board. We came up with a survey, and the survey was about back-to-school employment practices. The most common practice, especially with part-time faculty, but also with contingent faculty generally, is you don't find out what you're going to teach until about a couple weeks before class oftentimes. Sometimes a couple days before class. And I don't think I have a copy. The cover of the report sort of tells it all, and the title. Who is Professor Staff, and how does this person teach so many classes? Because you come to the schedule of classes and it says staff, 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 staff. That was a conscious choice of title by Maria Maesto, who's one of the authors of the report and the president of the New Faculty Majority. And it's a brilliant choice because what it does is it positions what it means for students. It's not just about these poor faculty finding out last minute. What does that do to their students? So if you read through that report, it's really interesting in two ways. It's a new methodology for doing surveys. How do you study contingent faculty who work at multiple places and the institutions say, we don't know who's teaching for us? You push it out through social media, through listservs. You put it on Facebook. So this combined effort of ours built on an effort by the Coalition on the Academic Workforce, which did a survey of contingent faculty that did the same thing. They didn't do traditional sampling institution by institution. They pushed it out through listservs and social media, and they got 20,000 usable responses. It's the biggest survey of contingent faculty, I think, arguably ever. The second interesting thing about the survey is it gives the faculty's voice talking about, so there's closed-ended responses and then open-ended responses. If you go to the website of the New Faculty Majority, which is pretty easy to find, they have a copy of the survey. You can adapt it. You can use it. And part of what we're encouraging local faculty groups to do is to run this survey and publicize it. And when you find out that 55% of your faculty have fewer than 3 weeks' notice before they start classes, that 50% have no access to library resources until a week or two before classes start, that large proportions have no access to the course management system or even the class list before the first day of classes, you say this is not the way to serve quality education. You can change the conversation, and a virtual online survey is a lot cheaper to run than traditional surveys. Okay, here's the mix. Reversing the circuitry. So I spoke in November to SEIU, which is organizing a local in Washington, D.C. And they have organized George Washington University part-time faculty, American University, Georgetown faculty are about to vote. They've organized the Montgomery County Community College, but they also have Oxfam workers, social service workers, Head Start professionals, K through 12. So they're infused throughout the community. And what I suggested to these folks as part of their Metro strategy was that part-time faculty who have no resources given to them by their employing institutions should reclaim ownership of the curriculum. They shouldn't be teaching canned curriculum that Pearson creates or some textbook company creates or Coursera courses that are mass-produced. They should be producing curricula within this context that is specific to the issues and the problems of groups that in this case are actually all part of the same local. It doesn't have to be unionized. It doesn't have to be this way at all. It could be in a larger area. It could be in a smaller area. It could be in a rural area. But the idea is if you're going to teach a composition course, if you're going to teach an Intro to Soc course, if you're going to teach any basic education course, it should speak to the lives and the realities of the students and the communities that you're situated. And here I come back to Luis with his call for substantive inclusion. With a really nice talk about going from Mendez to Brown, and in both those court cases, the idea was to include students. That's how you enhance their education. And the starting point here is to acknowledge that our current education system and our current curriculum, mass-produced for the most part, is not serving the growth demographics of students. So what Luis calls for, rightfully I think, is to include substantive dimensions of local lived experiences and assets, not just to see communities in terms of deficits. That's part of the idea of a metro curricular cooperative, a group of faculty who are working in multiple institutions. They have multiple networks within that community. They may be focused on different issues depending upon the community, but they speak to the lives of the students and communities in which they're situated. And as Luis said in his lecture, smart educational systems treat local context as potential resources for development. Now, what I've done here now is to cite another authoritative source, my wife, from whom I first learned about the importance of local community. When I was in graduate school, she was a bilingual, she was also educated at UCLA. She was a bilingual fourth grade teacher in Boyle Heights at Second Street School. And it was really through her eyes, as I was studying all this abstract sociology about inequality, reading Althusser, Gramsci, Poulantzas, all these European theorists. She was in East LA teaching kids and learning from the communities and the parents and the kids that she was working with. So when I was, after watching Luisa's lecture, I was talking with her about it, and she just sort of spontaneously said, well, yeah, because education is not just information, which is what MOOCs are: information, passing, delivery, processing. Education is socially, culturally, and developmentally situated. It's local. And so that's the idea of a disruptive local technology that speaks to the lives and reflects and honors with some level of dignity and recognition of value the lives of the communities and the people that are being taught. So to complete the completion agenda, we need to increase accessibility and connectivity and relevance in the ways that I'm talking about for these growth demographics of students. And as I say in this liberal education article, if you care about enhancing quality in college, then you should also care about enhancing the working conditions of the professoriate. You should be prioritizing, and this is really to Arizona and to California, what if policymakers were to prioritize tapping into the potential energy and talent of the current demographic wave instead of running away from it or trying to virtually serve it? If you care about the American dream and America's promise, then you should be troubled by policies that turn resources away from and institutions away from providing that promise to the growth demographics of our students. And then finally, if you're going to invest and prioritize Academy's innovative potential, how can you not invest in the workforce, which is at the center of that creativity, which is faculty? And I think as I look at Jack, who's been fighting for the importance of faculty and the investment in faculty and the significance of a high-quality faculty workforce, a full-time faculty workforce, for quite a few decades, I think it's no more important than now to say, if we're going to move into some sort of knowledge society and economy, how can we have all these policies, none of which pay attention to how are we preparing for a next generation of faculty? Because we just assume we can slot people in just in time, just in class, just at will, in ways that don't serve the students that are in front of us. So completing the completion agenda requires collective action of all sorts, coalition that gets us outside just the academy, and grassroots, nationally articulated pursuit of the common good. Thanks. You all stayed. Not succinct, but questions? Mm-hmm.
So I was reading online, academics were having a discussion about specifically, excuse me. I'm terrible with microphones, okay. I was reading online with a set of academics who were talking about MOOCs and talking about a specific model of them, whereby I think some Harvard faculty were providing these courses and not getting paid for them.
Mm-hmm.
And the discussion was with regard to labor force. Well, what does this mean if there is a certain segment of MOOCs that are being offered where all the people who are participating, the faculty, the graduate students are facilitating, all of them are not being paid? What does this look like in the future in terms of devaluing of work and all that other stuff? And I was just wondering what you thought about that, if you could respond.
So a couple thoughts. One is, in a related vein, I was talking with a faculty member who's a contingent faculty member who had been asked to teach a MOOC, and who felt basically, well, what kind of choice do I have as a non-tenure track person? If I say no, I don't want to sign away my intellectual property, I don't want to teach online. It wasn't a MOOC, it was an online class. Then they're not going to renew my contract. If I say yes, then I'm just basically giving up my ownership of my own intellectual property. You're sort of in a lose-lose situation. There's some iterations of MOOCs. MIT's open course system is another example, where it's all about open source. You're going to do this for free. You'll notice who's doing it, though. It's a loss leader. It's not, there's no sort of sustainable business model for how this is really going to be a way to deliver education on any sort of significant scale. The one that gets a lot more attention and that has much more promise, and that the American Council on Education is talking about and is in the process of figuring out how to give credit for is Coursera, which is a for-profit model. A couple of venture capitalists, a couple of faculty at Stanford, so another coast, but a similar type institution. And the model there is sort of equally problematic in the sense of devaluing work, which is at the heart of your question, Debbie. And that is that the only work that is really seen as real and significant is the work of the talking head giving the lecture. It depends upon auto-grading, on peer-based consulting, on a whole range of unseen and unknown people out in the field. It's a completely unexplored, there are all sorts of unexplored and unconsidered problems that are only beginning to emerge. Like, how do you deal with hate speech? How do you deal with aggressive, inappropriate comments? How do you deal with cheating? I think cheating's a problem at some of the elite institutions as well as the non-elite. And so the little research that's been done or little evidence that's been accumulated suggests maybe there's a success rate of 10%. Duke did a nice analysis where they found a success rate of 3%. Most of the people who took the class and completed were people who already had BAs. They're kind of doing it as like a lark. It is not, by any stretch, a model that serves the students who are getting turned away from the UCs, the Cal States, and the community colleges in California. So in that sense, it, at one and the same time, both devalues the work of all the people outside of the non-elite places. And I think that's probably the biggest devaluation of all, to get to your question. It's, nobody's suggesting that we should go to Central Arkansas and have someone from there lecture to 2 million people. And maybe some Stanford people could take that class. It's the elites saying, and professors at the elites, this is not just institutions. It's like in Sheila and I's book, Academic Capitalism. Faculty are complicit in this, some faculty. What that does is to devalue the work of all sorts of other faculty, as well as graduate employees and a variety of other folks. So I think it's an even deeper devaluation, maybe, than your original question, because it's saying the real cool stuff has only happened at these places. And as I said earlier, the irony is we've been trashing lectures for years. Show me a teaching center on any university campus that says lecturing is a good thing. You can't find them. Now, I don't agree with that, but I certainly don't think you want to be lecturing to 150,000 people. It's just not, it's not a model that's even been examined as a viable model business-wise, let alone education-wise. But the fascination for it suggests something about what we're trying to do. We're trying to substitute virtual for real, and who are we trying to substitute virtual for real education for? Good question. Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, what's your take on the recent passing at the state capitol here in California of the research assistants at the CSU and UC possibly being unionized? What's your take on that, and do you think other institutions or elite institutions like that are compatible to the UC whatever research one
Mhm.
tier. What's your take on that? Do you think that will, be an example for other large-scale institutions?
It's like with the postdocs. As the career realities of academic employment become more and more clear, and as the age of academic employees gets older and older and they have a variety of family and other responsibilities, the idea that somehow you're an apprentice and you should be able to put up with conditions of work that are not beneficial either to you or to the people you're working with is something that, in the case of graduate employees, there's been organizing of graduate employees for 50 years. The argument against graduate employees being able to unionize makes absolutely no sense. University of Michigan graduate teaching assistants have been unionized for 50 years. Wisconsin, equally long. I think those are still pretty good research universities. I don't think that compromised and undermined relations between students and faculty. The contest now, oftentimes, in Michigan as well as in California, is about whether research assistants, in addition to teaching assistants, should be able to unionize. And again, there's examples of places that have done that. It doesn't appear like the SUNY system, the SUNY graduate assistants who were hired through the Research Foundation. So they actually have a separate union from the teaching assistants. It doesn't appear to me that SUNY Albany is suffering dramatically from those students having unionized a number of years ago. It's really a question of, and this is unfortunate because what happens as the graduate employees unionize is there's been a turn to postdocs. Postdocs haven't been unionized. You can pay them less, they don't have health care, you don't have any kind of educational responsibility to them, they're already trained, more international, so they're more scared of you. In either case, you're relying upon working conditions for a central part of the workforce, whether it's in teaching or in research, who are absent any kind of the normal due process protections or academic freedom protections that you would hope and want members of the instructional or research workforce to have. I mean, what does it mean to say that a large proportion of funded research is done by people on soft money who have no independence other than being able to get another grant from the agency or the company that's funding them? How much freedom does that give you as a clinical medical researcher in evaluating whether this drug works or that drug doesn't work? It's not a good position for us to be in socially where people don't have the independence either to speak out in their teaching about issues that are important and to challenge conventions and to deeply explore issues that, I mean, my God, we're in a country where evolution is controversial. Climate change is controversial. Does it serve us to have 2/3 of the instructional workforce unable to deeply explore those issues for fear of offending a student who will complain and then they will be non-renewed? And similarly on the research side, does it make sense to have people who are sort of at the whim, in this case, frankly, of faculty members and departments? And I think the answer is no. So the UC's, the research assistant struggle is a more recent one, and it's been particularly prominent at Michigan and UCLA. But the organization of graduate employees has been around for a long time. And I think it's hard to make an apprenticeship argument to graduate students who realistically are not looking at, all they need to do is read Jack's book. I'm serious. All they need to do is recognize every graduate student should have to read that book. I gave a talk in November to a public sociology conference of graduate students, and that's part of where this idea about engaging the community with your teaching and your research came from. Marissa Allison was the leader of this conference. She's a graduate student in sociology at George Mason University. She introduced herself as, I am a future contingent faculty member. But that's true. that's more true than saying I'm a future tenure track faculty member. The odds are more likely that she's right. Now, she's not embracing that as, oh, this is wonderful. She's recognizing it and then in a whole variety of ways working in various groups, like with the new faculty majority, like with SEIU in the Metro DC area, to organize to say, wait a minute, let's create some conditions that make this a livable professional kind of employment. But first you got to recognize it. And I think too many people in graduate programs now don't understand what is the future. And it's not only in the social sciences, as I said. In the sciences, their future is 1, 2, 3 postdocs. The average age now of a first major NIH grant is now 43 or 4. It used to be in the 30s. And so you're asking, what does that mean for diversifying the faculty, something that Daryl's devoted her entire career to, diversifying institutions and graduate students and undergraduate student bodies and faculty. What does it mean for diversifying the faculty in terms of gender to say, by the way, you're going to have to wait until you're 43 years old before you get your first real grant that secures whether you're going to make it here. So we've created a profession that is unattractive, something both Jack and Daryl have talked about. How can we make this a more attractive profession to this generation of prospective faculty? And I kind of speak to this, as I do so much, from a pretty personal level. I have 2 daughters. One's in public health. The other's in marine ecology at UC Davis. She's a teaching assistant and a research assistant. And the younger one has thought about being a faculty member, but as she goes from place to place and watches this assistant professor and this postdoc, it's like they don't have a life. So we're not creating the conditions that enable us to have the most central feature of a knowledge society that you can have, which is a viable intellectual workforce. That's pretty dumb. Pretty dumb as a country. So that's my comment on the graduate employees. That's a marker for the general unrest about the reality of what the academic workforce is like today. Now, I don't want to depress everybody. Some people still are getting tenure track jobs. You're in a fabulous institution. I'm sure you'll all get. But I do want to say, and I've talked a lot about unions, but I want to say there are a variety of ways to take responsibility for your professional workplace. And one of the most local places to shape what your life is like and what life is like for those around you is your department, your college, your institution. And I always have a lot of appreciation and affection and admiration for people who recognize that part of being a professional is taking ownership of what is your professional workplace like? Is it sufficiently diverse? Is it a place that values exchange and pushing the boundaries and the freedom to speak about a whole variety of things? You can actually control that in your place. Is it a humane place where when you're going up for tenure, there's some recognition, you're going to be fine. Your productivity is terrific. Yes, it's a crazy process, but you don't, I know it's easier to say that on this side of the desk than that. But let me make this a humane process versus some places, and your place is a humane place, so I'm safe saying this. And so is mine. But there are a lot of places, and I have a lot of junior colleagues and former students who are in places, and they're not bad people. They're just out of control in terms of the tenure process. I've had students who had to get 12 letters, or who have to wait for long, long, long periods of time with nobody saying anything to them about how the process is going. And what each of us can do, and what you have role models of having done, whether it's Scott and Cecilia or Jack and Daryl, and now Debbie, is creating a workplace that's full of mensches, not jerks, that cares about human beings. You can have a life, you can laugh, you can wear jeans, you can be comfortable, you can bring your kid, you can, whatever it is that's important. Because we're whole human beings, we're not just professors. And that's something everybody has control over. And you can, some people do that in unions, some people do it in AAUP organizations, some people do it in diversity groups. But find a way, because that's your responsibility. It's not sufficient to say, oh, the system's too big. Yeah, well, it's not too big to affect this room. It's not too big to affect your department. You can do that, even as a graduate student. You got more power than you think. Other questions? Hmm. My answers are too long. Mm-hmm. Go, Luis.
Okay, so you spoke of this concept of this incentivizing policies that move institutions away from low-income students. Okay. Okay. So you speak of this idea of disincentivizing, which you referred to as policies that move institutions away from lower income students. And, you know, in Arizona, Tucson specifically, during the political agenda on Mexican American studies, what support or pushback did universities display for this group of targeted students and teachers? Because I kind of missed the presence of university support. Now, ethnic studies includes African American studies, Asian American studies, and so forth. But why, you know, why wasn't there the presence of the university when obviously the focus was specifically targeted towards Mexican American studies?
It's even worse than that, because in the process of attacking Mexican American studies in TUSD, the state superintendent of instruction indicated that the problem was the cancer of Mexican American studies in the university. So he didn't just attack the schools. That's bad enough. I'm not saying just attack. He also attacked the university. The role of the university, and this sort of gets to what is your potential for action. The role of the university was dead silence. Total dead silence. The role of people within the university is different. So there are a variety of groups within the University of Arizona which have run forums, which have circulated petitions, as I did, which have worked with the teachers, worked with the students, held classes for the students when those classes were disbanded, and held alternative classes. But there was also an economics professor. He's still on the board. He was chair of the board that made the decision. So in a sense, there should have been a university response. Our president and our deans should have come out and defended the integrity of Mexican American studies within the university and within the schools. It did not. Just like they should have come out when Pima voted for in-state tuition for DACA people who went through the DACA process. Our president should have come out and said, okay, now let's put that on the Board of Regents agenda for the public universities. She did not. She put out a message that indicated she was very sympathetic to people working very hard. And here's a statement from the board. And the statement from the board was, we will not be considering any new agenda items with regard to this matter. So there are multiple possibilities. Within my own department and within my college, a junior colleague, Nolan Cabrera, who's from UCLA, was designated by or picked by the grand special master of the federal court, because TUSD is under a desegregation order. And so the federal court comes in and says, wait a minute here, let's see what's happening, because this districts under a court order to desegregate, and this curriculum was part of an effort to be more responsive to the local realities and assets of Mexican American students. So Nolan was selected by the court to do an analysis of the effectiveness of the Mexican American Studies curriculum. And as an assistant professor, he did that. And he came out with a report that was signed onto by Jeff Milam, who's a faculty member in our department, a full professor, and by our dean. The university didn't want to publicize the report. The university PR office did not want to circulate the report, but we posted the report. When I say you can create action locally and space locally, a faculty member, unnamed faculty member at a peer institution, which has a fairly strong reputation, asked me when I was telling him about Nolan's great work, can he do that and get tenure? I said, he can at Arizona. And then the subtext is, why the hell can't he at your place? Why would you even ask that? So the answer is both positive and negative. Negative on the, shame on the university, but bravo to the spaces within the university where people said, no, we're doing something. And I think that's part of the contest. And that's part of the contest that your colleagues and faculty have been participating in locally and nationally in a whole variety of ways for decades. And that's kind of, I think, a good model for you. And from what I've heard, you're going to more than take up that mantle and push it. And the thing to figure out as you go through your career is finding places where people respond, not the way this other faculty member did about what Nolan's doing, but the way I and the dean and all of his colleagues have responded, which is good. We're going to protect you. We're going to support you. And we're going to help you see how you can do this work and succeed academically, not make a choice.
Gary, I don't want to cut off questions. I just want to call attention to
It's midnight.
Activism on the front line here, okay? All of our students are as you pointed out, impressively engaged in the community and in local, as well as far beyond. But a cheap commercial plug. Tomorrow, Luis Garcia, one of our doctoral students, will be presenting at Harvey Mudd College noon, a Cesar Chavez lecture in art demonstration. And the title of the talk, my title will wake up here, it's going to be in the aviation room in the Harvey Mudd Dining Commons. And the title of the talk will be Celebrating Community in the Classroom and Beyond, the core values of Cesar Chavez in an education setting. And so I'd like to congratulate you, Luis,
Yeah, bravo.
And encourage all of us.
I think we're gonna thank Gary for coming, for helping, for shaking up, for giving us ideas on how to keep disrupting the momentum here. So thank you for coming and taking
Yes,
care of
thank
your
you.
work.